Good evening, everyone. I'm Sarah Burnett, the Director of the Grant Foundation. It's a pleasure to welcome you all here tonight for the opening of the exhibition Eternal Gradient, Arakawa and Madeline Gins, tracing the emergence of architecture as a wellspring of creativity and theoretical exploration for the artist Arakawa and the poet and philosopher Madeline Gins. This exhibition features over 40 drawings and other archival materials that illuminate a pivotal moment within a practice that spanned nearly 5 decades of collaboration. Through our exhibition program at the Graham, we often explore work that intersects with architecture in different ways. Artists taking on the subject of architecture, for instance. But here, in the work of Arakawa Gins, we see the work that represents the artist's first turn to architecture as a field of practice. And while predominantly known for their early digital experiments in architecture, and later realized projects in New York and Japan, this exhibition uncovers little-known work produced as they were moving closer to and into architectural design practice. In doing so, Eternal Gradient offers an entirely fresh perspective on their work and the very first opportunity to view much of the work that is on view, such as the exquisite suite of 24 screen valve drawings, 20 of which are installed on the first floor and 4 on the second floor central galleries. This exhibition was originated by the Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, or GSAPP, Arthur Ross Architecture Galleries. And it's been a pleasure to extend our long-standing collaboration with Columbia. We've exchanged and brought many shows to both New York and Chicago working together. This exhibition is made possible in part by the Estate of Madeline Gins and through a partnership with the Reversible Destiny Foundation. We are grateful to all of these institutions for making it possible to have this exhibition here at the Grand Foundation. Tonight we have the team that made this project, and they're going to offer some brief insight into the work and the exhibition. From left to right, we have exhibition curator Irene Sunwoo, GSAPP Director of Exhibitions and Curator of the Arthur Ross Architecture Gallery. And it's great to have Irene back in Chicago. Irene was the Associate Curator for the first Chicago Architecture Biennial. We also have Tiffany Lambert, GSAPP Assistant Director of Exhibitions, with us tonight in the audience, who curated the exhibition with Irene. Next, we have Hepworth, the Director of Collections at the Reversible Destiny Foundation. And finally, we have exhibition designer Kelley, a Chicago and New Orleans-based architecture and design collective founded by Carrie and Thomas Kelley. I want to take a moment to personally thank all of you guys. It's really, you are an extraordinary team to work with, and it's really an incredible exhibition, and I think you all also had a vision for this being here at the Graham. I think tonight, just maybe 2 hours ago, it all literally came together. I also want to thank the incredible team at the Graham Foundation for your incredible dedication and hard work, as well as Andrew Kephart of GISM, who fabricated the cages and worked some magic yesterday, Daxon, who produced the incredible floor drawings, and NFA Space, who hung the exhibition. After their brief presentation, I'd like to invite you all downstairs for a reception. We do have some books by Arakawa Gins on their work in the bookshop, and we also have all books on sale tonight. And with that, please join me in welcoming Irene Sunwoo and the Dream Team.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be at the Graham, but it's a real special pleasure this evening to be here on the occasion of this exhibition. I'm thankful to Sarah for many things in life, but tonight I'd just like to express my sincere gratitude for the invitation to bring this project to Chicago and for this opportunity to see all of these fabulous drawings and to introduce this aspect of Arakawa and Madeline's work to a new audience. I also like to say thank you to Ellen and Ava and Alex and Ron for all of their help over the past couple of days and weeks and months, actually, getting this together. And as Sarah mentioned, this show originated at GSAPP, and I would just like to say thank you also to our Dean, Andros, for her support of this project. And she has, on a weekly basis, told me how excited she is that this show is coming to the Graham specifically. And I'd also like to, again, acknowledge Tiffany Lambert, who helped steer this project from beginning to end, and also to everyone at the team you all for your contributions to the project. So my remarks tonight will be very brief. And I'd like to just begin by explaining the genesis and aims of this project, and then offer a short summary of each of the curatorial sections of the show that's on display in the gallery. And then after me, Stephen will give some insight into the individual practices of Arakawa and Madeline, and he's the real expert on the extent of their careers. And then Carrie and Thomas will provide some details and secrets about the exhibition design. I only discovered the architectural work of Arakawa and Madeline somewhat recently. In late 2016, I had attended a screening of the film Children Who Won't Die, a 2010 documentary about their 2005 project, the Reversible Destiny Lofts in Tokyo, which you see on the screen here. And this is perhaps their most well-known architectural project. The film uses this building, which eschews flat surfaces, incorporates textures and physical obstacles, and is kaleidoscopically colored, to unpack the artist's concept of reversible destiny, a philosophy of life based on the argument that through a more integrated and dynamic relationship between the body and the architectural environment, both human perception and consciousness could be fully stimulated and activated, in turn leading to a more heightened experience of the world and of the self. These ideas might seem to advocate for immortality. One of the artist's key slogans is that humans need to learn how not to die. But alternatively, I think we could interpret this imperative as an invitation to really rediscover new ways of living more fully. And just more images of the interior of the project here. So as you can see in these details, the lofts have these actual geometric volumes which serve as rooms. Interestingly, there are no doors in these apartments, and there are these rough surfaces throughout the building, so it's really meant to be touched and experienced sensorially in all aspects. So as I began to think further and research on their architectural practice, having had this point of entry through the Reversible Destiny Lofts, I came to discover that during the 90s and early 2000s, their preoccupation with architecture did in fact yield a few built projects. So here you see a monumental park on the left in Yoro in the Gifu prefecture, where you see some of those aspects that are in the interior of the Reversible Destiny Lofts as an actual very, very monumental landscape. I think this park is about 400,000 square feet. And on the right, a full-scale permanent installation at a museum in Nagi, which was designed by Arato Isozaki, who was a dear lifelong friend of Arakawa, who had invited the artist and Madeline to produce this permanent installation on the site. So during this period of the 90s and 2000s, Arakawa and Madeline were really enchanted with digital technologies which were emerging at the time, and which allowed them to speculate how this concept of reversible destiny could really be achieved at a much larger scale. So not just the domestic, but also the urban, and we'd like to think also the global, as implied by this image here. And so so this was my introduction to Arakawa and Madeline, although I realize they also have had kind of cult status within architectural culture, and also in art history as well. But I wanted to explore a little further, this highly productive practice. How exactly did architecture become so central? Because in fact, they really focused specifically on architecture for about 5 decades of their career, and towards the 90s and 2000s, Arakawa, in fact, had completely abandoned painting.
And so there really wasn't any written explanation of any of this in historiography. In fact, in architectural historiography, they had been largely written out. So I sought out the foundation through a Facebook message, a cold call, and eventually got in touch with Stephen and his colleagues there, who kindly invited me to the archives and eventually to the art storage as well, where we discovered together a number of drawings. And in this sense, Stephen was absolutely instrumental in the development of this project. So thanks to him, I had this amazing access to this incredible trove of works, many of which hadn't been published. And I was happy also to see that these were drawings done by hand and not by computer. And in fact, it was the set of 24 screen valves that Sarah referenced, which she showed to me one day and which we realized had never been exhibited or published. And in fact, none of their friends who I had been in contact with and asked about their practice had ever seen these. And it seemed like no one in the office had seen them either. So upon the discovery of this set, it became clear that this could be a really worthwhile focus for an exhibition, this group of drawings done by hand. And a sort of key to this aspect of their creative partnership. Because, in fact, these drawings, as you'll see downstairs, they're really beautifully installed, but these are geometric units, they're spatial volumes, and again, 24 times, there's this experimentation with how to fill them, how to give them texture, how to divide the space, and how to play with perception through color, and also mesh, which is a recurring theme in the drawings and also in the exhibition design. So while the exhibition focuses on this period of the 80s, which is when most of the drawings in the exhibition date from, we also wanted to have a kind of brief introduction to their individual creative practices and kind of to tease out some shared sensibilities and methodologies. So Arakawa was an incredibly prolific painter, active through the 60s through the 80s. And as you can see here, architecture was really on his mind, even if it wasn't so explicitly spelled out. But there are these linguistic and visual games that he's playing that often incorporate blueprints. And I think Stephen can speak about this in more detail. And so downstairs we have some archival documents to kind of convey that interest, and in parallel with Madeline's own literary practice, again, also playing with words and images in a really unusual and experimental way. So we have a few of her books on display as well. And her writing is quite challenging, but really exuberant and fantastic to read. So the show focuses also in one section on a specific architectural project, which has the unusual title Container for Mind Blank Body. And through the archival research and research in the drawings collection, it was discovered that this was in fact their first proper architectural project. So by chance, it's not totally clear how this happened, but in 1983 they were invited by the city of Venice to propose a project for one of the islands in the lagoon. It seemed like there was some sort of cultural initiative to invite artists to program these islands, which were just populated with ruins. So they produced a series of quite large and exquisite drawings that detail a linear structure made up of all of these different containers through which a visitor would experience different perceptual challenges and also obstacles. You could walk through walls. You would see your memories from your childhood projected before you. So this was really a spatio-temporal experiment on quite monumental scale, as you can see from this drawing. The trees on the perimeter give you a real sense of how massive this vision was, this very first project of theirs.
Another key project that the show investigates is called the Bridge of Reversible Destiny, also known as the process in question. And this carries on the ideas put forth in the Venice, or the Venice project, the Container for Mind Blank Body, through a number of drawings. But also we have some really wonderful documentation of their foray into model making. So they produced a 40-foot model of this specific project, which also contains a sequence of containers all lined up through which the visitor would have, again, these supersensual experiences of the environment as well as these psychological experiences. So they produced this model, which was on display in an exhibition at the Ronald Feldman Gallery in 1990, and we have some really wonderful photographs documenting the construction and development of this model. And by this point, at the late 80s, they were kind of full-blown into model making in the studio as well. So downstairs, there's a group of really nice Polaroids which capture that studio life. We have another section on the second floor which focuses specifically on Arakawa and Madeline's interest in the body. They were fascinated by Helen Keller, who features in a book that Madeline wrote, but also in their research. And you know, if we think about it, Helen Keller, this person who experienced the world through touch, it makes sense why they would be so interested in her. And there's this idea also that she would have these other types of senses that we are not even accustomed to. And so they were interested in unlocking those. So some of the archival material is their images. So it's quite interesting that they were trying to find a way to visualize these sensory experiences, which is a very specific type of artistic investigation. So we see that happening in a lot of the drawings that are on display around this archival case, such as the lead image that we've been using for the show. This really fabulous large drawing done in colored pencil, but interestingly, this is also a sketch for a digital drawing. So these are on that cusp of that transition into the computer technology that they jumped on with full force. And this image is kind of our closing image in a way. It encapsulates a lot of the ideas throughout the different sections. So on the one hand, this investment in the container as a real site of experimentation and for thinking through all of the body's potential ways of engaging the architectural surrounds. But at the same time, this drawing, which is quite large, is also a sketch for a digital image, which you see on the right. So it's interesting that they're thinking at the scale of painting, actually, but also with Madeline's hand written notes at the bottom of it, and then we can see how this is translated later into digital technology. So this is, I think, quite important find in that this is a moment where the artistic and intellectual practice is verging on these two different types of media, but also trying to explore the body further and much more rigorously through that type of documentation. So I will end there and pass it over to Stephen.
Fine. Sure. Okay, thank you. The Reversible Destiny Foundation was set up in 2010 by Madeline and Arakawa. It was one of a series of foundations that they had created, was serial foundations, and this was the year that Arakawa in fact died. It's a slightly absurd, well, for me it's an absurd title because it's written in my visa, so every time I go through immigration I have to explain that I'm not part of a cult, but in a way this is a cult, and this show is another doorway into this strange world that they inhabited, or they created anyway. Arakawa came to New York in 1961. He was born in Nagoya in 1936, and the legend is that he turned up with $14 in his pocket and Marcel Duchamp's telephone number, and he rang Duchamp from JFK and said, "Why haven't you rung me?" And by lunchtime, they were together having noodles and wine, and they became very good friends, and we owned a number of works by Duchamp, and we still have certain things. But he was one of the artistic heroes of Arakawa, as was Leonardo da Vinci, and the other touchstone is Magritte. And somehow this defines a kind of ambition and a way of thinking about the world and his work. He immediately took up with Yoko Ono and moved into 112 Chambers Street, evicting Robert Morris in so doing, to set up studio there. And so he was suddenly at this epicenter of I guess, the avant-garde, if that's not a too ancient term to use these days, where he met kind of John Cage and Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns and numerous people. So he was suddenly thrust into this intense New York world. He used to go to openings with Andy Warhol, for example, and things like that. And he came here, and he'd already had some success in Japan, making what's now known as the Coffin series, which are these concrete like forms, kind of quite surreal in a way, set within set within wooden boxes and fabric. And to view those originally, you'd actually have to have the box lids removed to then view these works. But for some reason, there was very little response. It's one of those things where an artist moves country and continues making work. And I think also he was being challenged. He was amongst a whole different way of thinking and being. And so he started developing a new form of work. And what's interesting about these coffin works, I was always told that he never made them when he came to New York. And then I found documentation that proved he did. This is actually him in his studio at 112 Chambers Street. And there were exhibitions that he did with them, which have since been removed from his resume. So he's sort of self-edited himself, his biography. But what he became known for were what are known as diagram paintings. So paintings which are representations of ideas. This was one of the first series, which was known as the bottomless series, or if we start thinking about the infinite space. Space was a very important aspect for him, the consideration of it, and how it could be represented, and also how it can be constructed in the mind of the viewer as well. These are not paintings which are pictures of the world, they're things that you assemble in your own mind, and they're full of contradictions. So within this one, for example, you can see a perspectival box, but there are different forms of grids, ones that both define a kind of moving space and ones that exist in contradiction to that. And this idea of the contradiction and some space created within those contradictions seems profoundly important to him. At a certain point, this is a painting called Couple from 66 to 67. It's one of a series of rudimentary interiors where things are indicated with the application of a very simple line. These are often done in marker pen or graphite. Very very limited amounts of color are used, or colored pencil. And it's about the idea, all the time it's about him expressing the idea of different things. And he'll revisit paintings over and over again, making different versions of them, each one slightly different, and each time challenging your kind of, your construction of what your understanding of this work is about. Here you have a number of as I said, shapes, but words that appear on one, and then on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, they're replaced by numerals. There was until recently a painting up at the Art Institute, painted in 1968 called Untitled Number 2, which I was hoping to see, but I'm afraid it's no longer on the wall, which again alludes to the house plan that Irene was mentioning, but also suggests a space beyond through this cutout, which is a recurring motif where you get the edge of a canvas folded over to suggest the space beyond or behind. Arakawa met Madeline in 1962, and they actually got married in 1966 and moved into a huge townhouse building on 124 West Houston Street, which was 6 stories high, each floor 1,800 square foot. And this became, in a sense, their laboratory for thinking and for making. And one of the things is that with them, we can talk about them acting collaboratively, but they're also two individuals. So Madeline absolutely was a poet and a writer, and she became the primary interpreter also of Arakawa's paintings. So she kind of would fill this questioning space with even more questioning, with challenging texts. I remember as a student trying to read an article in Flash Art, which I found absolutely defeating, where I could read the rest of the magazine cover to cover. And I still am struggling with this language, which is a mixture of direct kind of direct speech to a viewer, the invention and rejections of terms, and really interesting ideas as well. So, in a kind of mixture of poetry and experimental writing, but also somehow centered around Arakawa. And clearly, they were working collaboratively over ideas, and at times things became. Madeline was more present and other times less present within Arakawa's painted work. What is stated as being their great collaboration is the mechanism of meaning, which is dated starting in 1963 and to 1971, then 78, then 88, and then finally it appears in final form in 1996. And in fact, there are 2 versions of this work. One that was made, was, if you like, the one that was continued to be worked on, and then there was one that was produced for a Japanese museum in 1988. And it's 80 panels, or the first version is 80 panels in total. Each panel is 90 inches by 66 inches. There's a tremendous ambition here. And it's organized in a series of chapters as well. This one, and I'm just going to have to find what the title is called. It's from chapter 6, and it's Expansion and Reduction, Meaning of Scale, and this is figure 5. And all of them have almost like an exercise which they're asking you to perform or think about, and some of them were interactive, and they appeared in book form as well, with various illustrations of people operating or interacting with these works. And these and again, research has led us to understand that Arakawa initially intended these to be 300 works in total, and his start date for that from documentation from Dwan Gallery, who he was involved with from 1964 till when it closed, was that it would be 300 panels in total. And he actually debuted some of this work at the Venice Biennale, where he represented Japan in 1970. Coinciding with this is a series of works which I call invitational works, which are works which invite you to consider something. For example, this work is called What Is Not Missing, and written along the bottom, which is common with all these works, is consider entire situation folded along the diagonal. Then he's clearly crossed out what is missing. and then written what is not missing. So there are inherent contradictions as you look at this, but also the point of me showing this image is to show the scale of the work. The work is already shifting to a work which is not a simple picture, but something that you start having to experience. It's a scale which is not something that you see at once, it's something that you move along the surface of. And he's constantly pushing at the viewer, or he's starting to consider the viewer as a body in the way that he's been considering the mind of the viewer as something where something is constructed, but also the body and how it moves in relationship to the work, to the painting. In the 70s, he developed these rotating forms which shoot lines out, or planes which could extend beyond the surface of the painting, capturing that viewer in that space. Here we have a mirrored version of the house plan, and you can imagine that you as the viewer are only able to, again, read this from behind. So it's this game of positioning you. This work just starts where we really start moving into crazy scales, really. This is 1982 to 1983, so it's just before the architecture happens. So there's this tremendous kind of push and ambition in scale going on all the time. This painting is 11 foot high by 37.5 feet long. And it's 5 panels, and just out of interest, I throw this image in. I can't even hang it in the main viewing room of our storage place. It's that big. However, it's not the biggest. There are many works which are 10 and 11 panels. So we're now really pushing at that architectural scale, I believe. And this is the moment where this show begins, in a sense. I could never understand with Arakawa's work, and again we come down to this idea of dating, and similar way with the mechanism of meaning. The bridge out there carries a date of 1973 to 1989. And looking at the paintings, I could never understand how that work began in 1973, how those ideas started maybe they started forming, let's say that. But in our archive, I found 2 photographs. Arakawa, the same age, dressed the same way. One of him downstairs in the basement of 124 West Houston Street with images of the Venice project, the drawings that are here in the show, and upstairs in a painting studio where these kinds of paintings, which are much more, I'm going to describe them as more contained, quite literally. They have 5-inch heavy frames around them. And when we got to look at these paintings, we realized that every frame was a different tone of white. So he's playing with a kind of, he's shifting it into kind of really playing with ideas of perception. And so what's fascinating is Arakawa maintained his studio practice from the start of the architectural work as shown here for another 7 to 8 years. And I think that's, and so these 2 practices existed in parallel with each other. And you can see in some ways, and I just want to move on to what is the final form of his work. This is him standing on a work called Beneath Untitled, which had floor panels which you stood upon while viewing the painting. And on there are images of bodies, a personal check, etc., his passport as well. So again, it's the identity of a person, the body is present there, you are standing upon that while viewing it. And these works got gradually more and more challenging. This is a work called Open Your Mouth and Close Your Eyes from 1989 to 1990, which is, this is a detail, it's 2 diptychs and 5 ramps which you are physically pulling yourself up to view the work. And finally, and for me, kind of really quite radically. You have this work, which is from 1990 to 91, which is called Then Close Your Eyes, which is 4 diptychs and 2 conveyor belts. So it's a room installation with conveyor belts where you're invited to be in motion while viewing the work. And so I think you're at this point where the architectural ideas are coming together with the studio practice in this way. This is a very sweet photograph of Madeline Arakawa in 2007. He dies 3 years later of ALS. She dies in 2014 of cancer. And it's a real tribute to their kind of relationship, which was fractious at times, as any couple is. And there are times when they are more present in each other's work and times when they feel like they don't exist. And so it's a fascinating kind of relationship which we're slowly unpicking at the foundation, coming to understand and being able to speak about, if you like, 3 people, Madeline Gins, Arakawa, and Madeline Gins. Okay.
Well, first off, we just want to extend our dearest and sincerest thanks to Irene for inviting us to collaborate on this project at the beginning, and of course to Columbia as well, and then of course to the Graham Foundation and their entire team for giving the project its second life that's here now. So this is a very abrupt slide. We realized we thought we'd introduce our approach to the project by first introducing ourselves and our approach to collaborations like Eternal Gradient that aim to, as the title suggests, that operate in the background, that are accessory to something sort of larger.
So to begin, we offer an analogy. If architecture were a double act, Norman Kelley strives to be the straight man or woman. Take, for example, a comedy duo, in which 2 differing personalities and sets of behaviors perform a comedy routine together, but from contradictory angles. One performer, the straight man or stooge, may have no comedic purpose but to act in a manner that makes the actual comic look good. Usually, the straight man's form of comedy is serious, nearly skeptical, so allowing the audience's perception of the actual comic's act to appear more ridiculous or shocking, with heightened effect. Examples include Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin, Abbott and Costello. The architectural equivalents might include Lily Reich and Mies van der Rohe, or Joseph Michael Gandy and John Sohn. For Eternal Gradient, Norman Kelley is the straight man and woman. Our aim is to make the artists we're working with look good. We accept our role like an architect is often required to do so. We listen and we interpret. It's a role we're very fond of replaying when the artist's work is so good.
So I suppose one way of playing the straight man and woman is thinking about exhibition design through the lens of something like preservation. The curator selects what will be shown, and then it's a matter of figuring out how the work could be viewed and, more importantly, remembered. So selecting the work is really the hard part. And so here you see Tiffany, Irene, and Stephen inspecting a bridge drawing, one that made the cut, in a giant art storage facility in Long Island City. And this was the first time, as these guys have mentioned, that these works were uncovered and shown. So for us, it was tremendous to be a part of that uncovering. In the end, nearly 40 drawings were selected, including these here, which for us we found provocative amongst the group in their selection process, because they started to introduce human figures wrestling with these spatial and material kind of impossibilities. There's that one again.
And in our research, we came across this photo of an exhibition Arakawa designed at the Ronald Feldman Fine Art Gallery in 1990. To engage work on the wall, one needed to climb a series of ramps distributed throughout the gallery floor with specific viewing positions relative to the work hung on the wall, as Stephen mentioned earlier. The ramps included a range of different steepness, and one even included ropes to assist your ascent. Here, perception is both a visual and a physical exercise. Observation required work. And finally, our research for how the work could be viewed came into focus. Our hope in the design would be to borrow these motives and extend this affinity for active viewing.
So in many of their spatial experiments, like this sketch for the bridge project, and to which our design is heavily indebted, the container, as illustrated here with nearly identical rectangular volumes articulated by grids composed of thin lines, is a recurring subject. We were initially attracted to this drawing's ambiguity. So are the masses closed? Are they open? Are they occupiable? Further research would confirm that the container, whether occupiable or not, is a site for holding perception. The artist sometimes referred to this concept as a perceptual landing site. And so our design would build off of this concept and this drawing pretty literally.
So this is what we are calling the 41st drawing in the show. It is an anamorphic drawing installed with a finely gridded vinyl below the mesh containers. It reenacts the impossible spatial conditions present in the artist's work and reconstructs Arakawa's sketch shown in the previous slide. As one shifts away from a specific viewing position, the two-dimensional deceit is revealed, and the containers take on other purposes, like supporting the display of hung works and shelving for archival material.
Just quickly to show you the original exhibition plan and its emphasis on this narrow viewing passage between the four mesh containers, a layout that to some degree recalls an enfilade, only its views that pass through the gap. And so it's worth noting that all artworks hung within the containers occur along their length, so as to not impede visibility through the mesh containers. Just in total, 4 mesh cages were designed, as well as a table for the artist's bridge model and 2 viewing benches.
And here the plan of the vinyl floor drawing, which you'll see in the downstairs gallery, measures approximately 17 feet long by 8 feet wide, and constitutes the lower portion of Arakawa's reconstructed sketch.
Perhaps the closest our design approaches the physical demands thematic to Arakawa and Gins' spatial experiments actually occurred in the labor to produce these exhibitions. So for those unfamiliar with the term, weeding is the process of removing unwanted material, and it's a manual process performed by hand.
The labor of the install also included some heavy lifting, as well as some maneuvering challenges posed by the stair in its new location. And we are incredibly thankful to the Graham Foundation for their patience, and to Andrew Kephart of ISM, who is located here in Chicago, for lending his on-site assistance.
You gave me permission at one point. Yeah.
It's revoked.
With that, we invite you to crouch, or rather sit, on the viewing bench located on the first floor to find Arakawa's hidden drawing. Like the work of Arakawa and Gins, it too resists passive viewing, and so it does not reveal itself immediately.
But if you're impatient, we recommend letting your camera be the viewfinder.
Rest assured, there are other moments that require far less work, like this window that is designed to frame a specific drawing in its near distance, or even to put two in dialogue with each other.
So we began the short presentation with the term accessory. Hopefully it's clear that we prefer a self-effacing set of architectural services. In short, we relied on smart people to circumscribe smart contexts. Then our job was easy, so we just listened closely and tried to play it straight. Thanks.
So we invite you all downstairs to the reception, and this dream team will be around. Thank you.
I love it.